Welcome back. The South African economy is in trouble and many citizens are feeling the effects of it. On Friday, President Cyril Ramaphosa unveiled a package of measures aimed at improving the performance of the economy to help create employment. The opposition parties, especially the Democratic Alliance, have been critical of how the ANC-led government manages the economy. The DA is vying to run the country and makes the point of referring to its successes in the Western Cape, particularly when it comes to managing the economy. And one of the party's leading lights is Gwen Ngwenya, who is the DA's head of policy. She joins us on the program to talk about this and a variety of other issues that face the political party and that are out there in the political field. Gwen, pleasure to meet with you and talk to you finally.
Thank you for having me here.
Right, let me start right there, out there in the Twitter sphere, in the social media space, which is where we had a bit of an engagement recently about the point of the agency. I know we must talk about the president and the measures that he unveiled. Yeah, you were baffled that I could talk about agency of citizens. Why is that?
Well, I was actually very supportive, but surprised to hear it because I don't often encounter people talking about agency. I think sometimes when you raise the point of agency, it's so often interpreted as saying, you know, oh, people are just lazy, they must pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So I think sometimes the word agency makes people feel a bit uncomfortable because it seems as though we're blaming the poor for their condition. But I don't think that's the case. I think we are recognizing that there are definitely conditions, structural ones, economic ones, that have placed people in that position, but that what we do to assist them should rather engender agency and for them to stand on their own 2 feet, as opposed to engendering dependency, which is often the path in terms of, if you look at our social assistance programs.
I've been kicked on my own. I've been kicked for suggesting that, right, away from that public discussion we had when I used the word agency. So the problem lies with that word, you reckon. Why do you feel people feel so strongly about it? I mean, where does this derive from? Because one would take it or regard it as common sense.
Yes. Well, I guess it's because people feel it's kind of assigning blame to what they would see as the victim. You know, many people are born into dire economic circumstances, and they don't see many options to lift themselves out of those circumstances. So when somebody says, you know, well, actually, you know, people need to exercise some agency, it almost seems as though we're shifting the blame from perhaps what government should do and perhaps what a growing economy should do, and shifting that responsibility onto essentially really vulnerable people. But
definitely vulnerable people do need support in any event, right? And there are many means to do so. There's housing and healthcare, education, and you name it. There are a few of those packages. Be that as it may, the economy has got to grow, taxes have got to be paid, jobs have to be created in any event, and we find ourselves in this situation as South Africa today, the very thing acknowledged by President Cyril Ramaphosa himself, and that's why he's unveiled the package of measures that he has. What did you make of his approach to dealing with the situation of an economy that's not growing, retrenchments taking place, and companies shutting down?
Well, let me first start with the positives, because I think sometimes as an opposition party, people feel we don't communicate the positives. So I think it's quite encouraging around the interventions to boost tourism and certainly to make it easier for people to do business in South Africa. I think relaxing those visa regulations is probably likely to yield some results, and probably short-term and rather immediate results. I think that's positive. It's also positive that we're focusing on making sure that fiscal expenditure goes towards infrastructure. Now that's very important because infrastructural investments are important to boosting overall economic activity. But maybe to go to the concerns that one might have with the stimulus package that has been presented, is that these infrastructural interventions are not new. Even as way back, I mean, so most of the budget towards this infrastructure fund seems to be directed towards revitalizing industrial parks. Now, industrial development zones, for example, you know, started as, even as far back as 2000, the year 2000, from the DTI, and there have been numerous attempts to revive them. I think the latest program being the industrial revitalization program. And I think, you know, So when you're not introducing something new, you have to explain why doing the same thing that we've been doing is now going to yield results when it hasn't in the past. So I think that's the gap, is saying, you know, these projects have failed in the past. What are we going to do differently to make them succeed? Instead, all we've heard in terms of this package is that we're going to throw more money at the problem. But money has often not been the reason why some of these projects have failed. It's policy incoherence. It's making sure that these industrial parks are located in the appropriate or close to the economic markets that they would serve. It's ensuring that they have a labor base from which those companies that will be in those industrial parks can actually access the right level and quality of skills that they need. And so there's not really much to say why is the environment going to be synergistic for these industrial programs to actually work?
And I will look at the detail in a moment. Yeah. I want us to take a step back.
Sure.
There was a time when the South African economy was growing at about 4 or 5%, and it could do with the global environment and situation at the time. And we had the financial crisis, the global one, in 2008, and the economies went down, but then they picked themselves up, and the countries that suffered severe backlash as a result of the financial meltdown of 2008 managed to get back up and grow at 3-4%. And South Africa, somehow it looks like we lost or missed an opportunity over the past 6 to 8 years.
But even in the mid-2000s, when we were growing, it was really quite cyclical. So the rest of the global, there was a commodities boom, the rest of the global market was actually growing. I mean, on some estimates, actually, we missed that boom. We should have been doing even better than what we were currently doing. And you're quite right. Whilst there has started to be a kind of global recovery after the financial crisis, South Africa doesn't seem to have recovered. And I would say it's because right from the beginning, even in the mid-2000s, we were growing because of the external conditions. We were not really growing because we had made sufficient internal structural changes to our economy. And similarly now, what we're seeing is that, for example, when there's been quite a lot of emerging market contagion at the moment. You know, when emerging markets do poorly, South Africa is one of the ones that usually also get dragged down and does quite poorly. And that usually happens, countries that are most susceptible to that kind of contagion, like South Africa, are ones typically that have weak economic fundamentals, and we certainly do. And until we fix those deep-seated structural issues that, yes, are going to take a long time, we're actually never going to get the kind of growth that we need to really create, you know, more and more employment.
From where you are sitting as head of policy of the DA, and you look at how we discuss or deliberate on economic policy and the choices that we make as a country, obviously led by the government, where do you see the shortcomings? I can mention a few that sometimes, you know, it's very hard to make sense of what we regard as a priority. On one hand, we talk about growth, and the other moment we say, no, we need more transformation or we need more empowerment. And the next moment we talk about employment as the key thing, and we say developmental state, that the state-owned enterprises must play a leading role, and the eNCA debts. So, you know, for an ordinary citizen, you're left with your head spinning, not being able to make sense of what we regard as a priority. Are you able to make sense of it? And if you do, please help me make sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the difficulty is that, or the reality rather, is that so much is wrong and needs fixing that it actually would be disingenuous to present a silver bullet. I think perhaps it's much more digestible when somebody comes out there and says, do you know what, if we can just fix the land issue, then South Africa will be on the right economic path, or if we can just do this. And sure, there will be people who try and do that, but it certainly isn't credible. There are many areas that need to pull together in order for our economy to succeed. And many of those, yes, people go on about them, we know them, you know, fix education, we need to invest in infrastructure, we need to make sure that it's easy to do business. And even each of those points on their own, you know, how to fix education, it sounds like one bullet point, but as you unpack it, you could talk the whole day. You could have even a week-long workshop or seminars just talking about how you're going to fix education. So there are, I don't know whether to say unfortunately, but it's the way that it is. It unfortunately is a complex thing, how to fix the economy.
It is a complex thing. The DA, as I said, refers to the Western Cape and say, we are doing a wonderful job, please like us, vote for us. Why should we like you, your organization? If you were in charge, what would you do differently?
Right. Well, some of our, again, probably not enough time to highlight all the many things that one would do, but maybe I can highlight some of the key interventions. Certainly, part of South Africa's economic or poor economic performance is linked to investor sentiment. People might not like that why do we need to keep these foreign people unhappy? But the reality is we need to attract investment in order to grow. And I think it's about actually having the right policies, not just policy certainty. Because I think people overuse that word. There's policy uncertainty, but there's no use being certain about the wrong thing. It's more than just uncertainty. We actually need to implement the right policies. So almost as a quick initial measure, we would scrap many of the pending bills that would actually increase policy uncertainty. So, scrap expropriation without compensation and commit to, for example, even the high-level panel's recommendations on land reform, we think are largely much more palatable than expropriation without compensation. Completely shelve bills like the private security industry, private security industry regulation amendments, which seeks to, make sure that ownership of these private security companies is mostly in South African hands. I don't think that's going to be good for investors who are currently heavily invested in the private security industry. I mean, I could go on. The nationalization of the Reserve Bank, the Banks Amendment Bill that seeks to establish state-owned banks. Just shelve all of, we don't need anything right now that's going to create more uncertainty. So first, as a first step, do that. Secondly, I think an important intervention is to make sure that we can drive local economic growth. If you look globally, cities are leading the economic agenda. It's not to say that only our metros must be the centers of growth, but certainly you want to ensure that they thrive as much as possible. Over 60% of South Africans live in urban areas. There's no reason to push against that trend. We should actually be pushing towards it. There's many positives around urbanization, and we need to make sure that we're also creating secondary cities, that we're not just overly relying on our metros.
Well, there are positive things, and there are certain things that may not work well for yourselves as a political party. I'll tell you about the public debates, the criticism you have faced as a result of those proposals that you've mentioned, some of them, that is. Gwen Ngwenya is the head of policy of the Democratic Alliance, and one of the young members of parliament in South Africa will be taking this discussion forward and other issues relating to the DA. In a moment, you too can be part of our conversation. Hashtag the Modise Network. Welcome back as we continue our conversation with Gwen Ngwenya, the DA's head of policy. She was talking about some of the DA approaches to managing the economy. They are out there, they are in the public domain, and she's one of the brains trust of the organization that came up with that. You mentioned things like scrapping land expropriation without compensation as one of the things that you think should be done or should have been done. Now, with respect to you, Gwen, a lot of younger people who side with the EFF will say, what's wrong with this young lady? What does she mean? All we want is land. Give us land and everything will work out fine. I nearly jumped out of my chair. I nearly fell off this couch.
Well, I certainly think people need to be enabled to own more land. I mean, and that's a slightly different element of the land debate, because the first question is how are you going to acquire the land in the first place?
You expropriate, you don't compensate, you take
well, that's what I'm saying, is that's the one component, and then it's to say, once you have that land, what are you going to do with it? At the moment, most property that's expropriated is actually kept in the hands of the state as a custodian and leased out to tenants. So actually, you're not going to become a property owner, you're going to become a tenant of the state. And so people must be first clear about that aspect of the conversation, so that the DA quite strongly feels that any land that's redistributed must be accompanied with secure tenure for citizens, and making sure that people have secure private property rights most of the time in the form of title deeds to secure ownership. So that's quite an important element. But then to go back to that first step, how do we intend to acquire the property that we would then redistribute? We think we must start with state-owned land first that's not in use, and to redistribute that, and to ensure that we roll out title deeds to people who already are living in RDP houses. The scale of those who actually live in state-subsidized or state housing but actually do not have title to their properties is quite staggering. So those kind of interventions are first the interventions that we need to make before we move on to the conversation around compensation.
Here's the view, which you know about. The view is that that's not radical enough, what you're suggesting, and I'm sure you've come under personal attacks yourself and other black members of the DA, because the view is perpetuated that the DA is a white party, and when you articulate the view that you have now is that you are protecting white interests. The simpler view is this: when you take land, you take it from white people and you give it to black people. So what can be so difficult about it?
Well, people need to understand, firstly, that expropriation laws don't just apply to white people. I mean, there's nothing that says we will only expropriate from white South Africans. So, firstly, any black property owner needs to be equally concerned about a law that guarantees expropriation without compensation. And secondly, the points that we've never really made a proper budgetary commitment towards the land reform program. I mean, at present, we were spending less and around the same amount on land reform as we were on VIP security in the country. So it just goes to show where our fiscal priorities are and how willing the government is to put its money where its mouth is. So it can only be in a situation where you feel the budget is being strained by its commitment towards land reform, where you could possibly say that compensation is the obstacle towards land reform. But that's certainly not the case. We've been massively underspending in that area when we could quite simply reprioritize expenditure towards more important areas.
Let me ask you this. I mean, how do you feel when you are personally attacked for articulating the views that you do? You're one of the young members of Parliament, right? Probably the youngest, or second youngest?
I think the second youngest, yes.
Right? So, and when people attack you now in that personal manner and accuse you, all right? And this is what I've seen, I've read, you've heard it many more times, that, this is a puppet for white interests. How do you feel about that?
Oh, it's pretty much a water off a duck's back at this point. So it might be newly again having rejoined the DA, but I mean, I was involved in student politics when I was at university. I was actually one of the first SRC presidents for the DA student organization when I was at university, at a time when the DA was still very, very small and certainly had very few presence on campus. And it was the first time that DASA had won an SRC election, which had mostly been won by the ANC Youth League or SASCO. So I'm quite used to that. Although what I will say is that I've detected a slight shift actually in political engagement, I think in recent times. When I was a student, which I mean I must admit wasn't that long ago, so about 10 years ago, let's say, at university, yes, there were those odd people who might really go to the extreme. At one point, I had on my door when I was still a resident of the university, I came back to my room after a kind of student body meeting, and someone had written the word traitor across my res room door. But apart from those incidences were outliers. I actually at that time was friendly with those members who were in SASCO and the ANC Youth League, and we'd often go out together and have intense debates. It was always about the substance of the debate. It was never personal. So that's what I find interesting now, is that more and more I start to hear this kind of language creep in where, I get called a house Negro or porch Negro, that kind of thing. I do sense a rising hostility to even the idea of debates that I didn't think was as present even just a few years ago.
Why do you think that is the case?
Oh, it's terribly difficult, to diagnose. It also seems to coincide with the rise in the number of people who are now quite willing to say, for example, that Nelson Mandela was a sellout. I think maybe it's just rising impatience that, people are tired of being sold, another package or another thing that's going to fix the country, another attempt. It's more than 2 decades after 1994. And I think, that rising resentment does increase skepticism, but skepticism where you're skeptical to the point of just rejecting anything, and we almost become a little bit anarchic in our in our behavior, and I think it gives rise to more populism.
Yeah, and at the same time, people look at how the political parties now seem to be having so many internal battles and issues. The ANC has got plenty, as we know, at provincial level. Now it's almost like the DA says, we too can have similar type problems, I mean, recently you could not make up your minds as an organization, it appears. The leader of the DA, Mmusi Maimane, we read, intends standing as the premier for the Western Cape, and a couple of days later says, I've declined the nomination and somebody else is being nominated, Alan Wynd, who's now been nominated. Are you having a problem maybe along racial lines, or what are the tensions within the DA all about?
There certainly are, very vociferous and strong debates in the DA, but as much as people might create this impression, they're definitely not along racial lines. I would say they do split along policy, or what might some people say then ideological lines, but I think that's quite right. That is the very purpose of a political party. If political parties aren't having intense debates, intense ideological debates internally, then where should those debates be happening? I think sometimes Africans might say, well, have those debates, but we don't want to witness them. Have the debates, come to a decision, and then come to us as the public with just one message. Look, that's one view, but I don't think it's the right view. I think South Africans would be poorer for not witnessing the internal debates. I think it's quite useful to know that, there seem to be people who think this in this party and other people who think this, and and to hear their arguments. I think being part of that debate is actually quite enriching for South Africans. I'm not quite sure why people want to just only hear one message and that's it.
Here's another point, because earlier I spoke to the Vice Chancellor of UJ, Professor Morwala, and we spoke about the 4th Industrial Revolution. It's happening anyway. It's not waiting for us to take any particular decisions. And I think it affects particularly younger South Africans as they contemplate their futures and the types of careers they have to choose. Yeah. What is your view about how we are managing the whole influence of the 4th Industrial Revolution?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's anything for a government to manage. I mean, innovation, where sort of the private sector and the market is given the space to do so, will innovate. In fact, most of the time, policymakers are woefully behind innovation. We see it even in financial markets. We're always trying to catch up with the new way they're doing things, and that's why there's almost new regulations all the time, because policy is behind innovation. I think the most, of course, innovation poses some challenges to those who might not have the skills that are required in a new knowledge environment. And I think the best that a government can do is to make sure that they work quite closely with industry, and that public education, so from basic education to higher education, also is working quite closely with industry and attuned to those technological changes to ensure that we're able to provide people with the kind of skills that enable them to keep up with technological change. And it's interesting that you say it mostly is going to affect younger workers. I think actually those who have middle age and older workers are actually really at risk as well. And I think people need to...
They too must pay attention to what's happening around them.
Yes, and we need to talk more about reskilling older workers as opposed to just providing skills to young South Africans. And we are working later and later. I mean, people like talking about young people, but even if we look at, well, it depends how you want to define young. Globally around the world, young is from 15 to 24. In South Africa, I think we're a little bit more infantilizing, and we make it 35. But even assume you're 36, so no longer technically youth. Yeah. You might have a good 30 years ahead of you.
I'm interrupting you because I want a brief response from you. My sense, notwithstanding the amount of talk that is out there politically speaking, is that more and more people are jaded when it comes to politics, really, because of the disappointments in so many areas at local level, provincial and national. Briefly, what is your sense, and what word of encouragement, if any, would you give us to participate in the public discourse on politics and the economy?
Yeah. I don't know if this is particularly encouraging, but it's worthwhile for people to know that we are going to have a government at the end of the day. There's no option of, you know, a state without a government. That's not currently something that's on the table. So we are going to end up with a government. And the best you can do is to treat elections like a multiple choice examination. There are options, let's say A to E. You can't wait for your ideal and say, well, I want option F. If option F is not currently there, you have to choose what's on the table. And I think it's important to pick then, even if it's in your view, the lesser then of all the evils, if you feel all the political parties have, you know, are disappointing.
So you can't stay it out. You can't stay out. You know,
yes, that's what I would say. Don't stay it out.
Yeah.
You know, write on paper the pros and cons of each one if you want to, but come to a decision. I think that's important.
Gwen, thank you very much for paying us a visit.
Yes, thank you very much.
And she is one of the young politicians in the country. She's member of parliament. She's head of policy of the DA. Pay attention to Gwen and other people like her who are running the affairs of the country, who are influencing policy making. And as she says, you know, you're always going to have government, whether you like it or not, and you can't wait for your best option to come along. What if it does not come? Thank you again, Gwen. And that's all we had for you this evening, and thank you again. Join us next week. This is the Modise Network. Say good night to you.